hammer and sickle is lord for the last time, and an era
followed by the reunification of Germany in 1990 and the end of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, later Russia, started to withdraw its troops from Eastern Europe. Major military powers no longer engaged in direct conflict. As a premise, the US assured the Kremlin that NATO would not expand 1 inch eastward, nor threaten each other's safety. NATO, the largest international military bloc in human history, was just 1,600 kilometers away from Moscow in 1990. In 1997, NATO accepted Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary as members. In Laskę, small town less than 6 square kilometers in central Poland, about 770 kilometers from the Russian border. American-made F-16 fighter jets can easily be spotted in the Lask military air base with commercial satellites. In 2014 alone, the U.S. deployed 12 F-16 fighter jets and 300 troops here at the same time. In Powidz Air Base, about 800 kilometers from the Russian border, satellites can observe the Boeing KC-135 Stratotanker and the C-130 Hercules. Advanced F-35 stealth fighters and B-1 bombers. In 2004, 7 Eastern European countries joined NATO. From 2009 to 2020, 4 more Eastern and Southern European countries became NATO members. In Amari Air Base in Estonia, about 200 kilometers from the Russian border, satellites can observe Apache attack helicopters. And Estonia's Tapa Airport, 130 kilometers from Russia, had been converted into a large army base, with soldiers stationed from the US, UK, and France. Satellite images reveal what NATO's eastward expansion actually means. In 1990, NATO's F-16 took about 80 minutes to fly over Moscow. In 1997, it took about 50 minutes. By 2002, it took just 30 minutes. If Ukraine joins NATO, NATO would draw even closer to the Russian border. In February 2022, Russia launched a special military operation in Ukraine. The Russia-Ukraine conflict has shocked the political and economic structures of the world.
In my opinion, the West bears primary responsibility for what is happening today. So we were arming the Ukrainians, we were training the Ukrainians, and we were forming ever closer diplomatic ties with the Ukrainians. And this spooked the Russians. It especially spooked the Russians in the summer of last year when the Ukrainian military used drones against Russian forces in the Donbass region. It especially spooked the Russians last summer when the British drove a destroyer through territorial waters, Russian territorial waters in the Black Sea. It especially spooked the Russians in November when we were flying bombers within 13 miles of the Russian coast. So all these events, coupled with this de facto bringing of Ukraine into NATO, pushed the Russians to what Sergei Lavrov said was the boiling point. First expansion of NATO, second expansion of NATO, and then all of these events associated with Ukraine. The Russians had had it. So you had a crisis of massive proportions. So what we did after 2014 with is double down, and what we're going to do now and what we're doing now is doubling down.
Although Ukraine has not yet joined NATO, the U.S. Department of Defense has still established a biological laboratory there. They have been studying plague, anthrax, hemorrhagic fever, and other high-risk pathogens for deadly disease, and the potential for bats and birds to transmit deadly viruses.
You want to understand that what we're talking about doing here is backing a nuclear-armed great power that sees what's happening as an existential threat into a corner. This is really dangerous.
The U.S. has caused global instability. Data shows that from 1979 to 2020, the U.S. was involved in more confrontation and conflicts than any other country during this period. And U.S. participation in confrontation and conflicts exceeded Cold War levels. In 2020, U.S. participation in the events of confrontation and conflict still accounted for 556.2 thousand pieces of information. The negative impact of U.S. involvement is more acute today than during the Cold War.
I don't think that what happened in the Cuban Missile Crisis was as threatening to us as this situation is to the Russians. But if you go back and look at how American decision makers thought at the time, they were scared stiff. They thought that Soviet missiles in Cuba was an existential threat. And they were willing, many of Kennedy's advisors, to use our nuclear arsenal against the Soviet Union. That's how serious great powers get when they think they face existential threats. Who bears responsibility for this? Do the Russians bear responsibility for this? I don't think so. But the question is, what caused the Russians to do this? And in my opinion, the answer is very simple: the United States of America. Thank you.
Ramadi is a city on the fertile land on the south bank of the Euphrates. It once abounded in dates, corn, and millet. Before the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, it used to be one of the richest cities in all of Mesopotamia. This is a satellite image of Ramadi in 2016. It shows that over 3,200 buildings were damaged and 1,165 of them were completely destroyed. The invasion of Iraq by the United States and its Western allies in 2003 caused the death of about 209,000 Iraqi civilians. Ramadi is not the only city that was destroyed after the 2003 invasion. Mosul, the second largest city in Iraq, was the center of the ancient Assyrian dynasty more than 3,000 years ago. It once owned the country's largest oil field and largest refining facility in the north. Almost every ancient city mentioned in the Bible was bombed during the war. Syria's Baghouz is another town in the Mesopotamia destroyed by U.S. airstrikes. In March 2019, 64 civilians in this town were killed by a U.S. airstrike. Afterwards, Americans used bulldozers to level the bombing site. U.S. subversion of the Syrian regime led to a protracted civil war with no winner. And Syrian people were the biggest victims of this war. The bombing by the U.S. and its Western allies had also brought devastating consequences to the city of Sirte in Libya. The movement of Arab nationalists was ascendant throughout many independent states of the Arab world in the 1950s and 1960s, which led to the rise of Nasserism in Egypt and Libya, and Arab revival of socialism in Iraq, Syria. These countries either controlled or maintained close proximity to major oil-producing areas. They sought independence and decolonization, unwilling to be manipulated by the U.S. and other Western countries. So the U.S. invaded or subverted the regime.
Well, American strategy in the Middle East for at least the past 25 years has been pretty much a failure. We've been trying to transform the region in a variety of different ways. The most obvious example of that was the invasion of Iraq in 2003, which some Americans thought would begin a process of democratization that would spread throughout the region. Obviously didn't work out very well at all.
One of the important purposes of the so-called process of democratization is to maintain U.S. energy supply and control. But this process often leads to violent turmoil in the global energy market. While the U.S. continues to impose sanctions on another major oil producer, Iran. Since the new century, the targeted entities of U.S. economic sanctions increased from 69 to 176. Net sanctions entities and individuals also increased by 933%.
L'essence du piège américain, c'est d'expliquer comment, depuis 20 ans, les États-Unis utilisent le droit comme arme de guerre économique. Et cela au travers de différentes lois qu'ils appliquent de manière extraterritoriale afin de régir les flux commerciaux dans le monde, afin de régir le commerce dans le monde.
Even in 2021, when global trade saw a sharp drop due to the pandemic, the trade friction index between the United States and other countries was at a high level for 10 months of the year, ranking second in the world. By analyzing the types of events of U.S. participation in confrontation and conflicts, data shows that events related to fight exceed 20% since 2003. Experts once analyzed that there are economic and financial interests driving every war the U.S. has started. After the U.S. financial crisis, due to lack of regulation in 2008, the U.S. government adopted unconventional quantitative easing monetary policy. This has resulted in a continued rise in the prices of soybeans, grain, wheat, and food worldwide over the 10 years, and intensifies the inflation of low-income or emerging market countries, which to a certain extent has changed the global income distribution pattern and made inequality much worse. From military incursions to economic sanctions, long-arm jurisdiction and America First economic policy, the U.S. does not hesitate to sacrifice global economic security for its own economic interests.
Lack of awareness of their action. It's like a bunch of kids running around with guns shooting all over the place without realizing what they're actually doing, without looking at the cumulative impact of all of this. Every congressman has a pet project, everyone wants to sanction someone, but you have to look at the cumulative effect of all of this, and the world is paying attention. And all of this is happening at the time that the US is increasing its debt like there is no tomorrow. When you run a deficit of $2 or $3 trillion a year, this money needs to come from somewhere, and you're expecting all those countries to finance your deficit.
Satellite remote sensing has observed global carbon dioxide emissions from space. It shows that the most economically developed regions, such as the United States, Europe, and East Asia, appear to have the most pronounced emissions. But that doesn't reveal the real reasons behind Earth's carbon emissions. Cumulative carbon emissions since 1850 in developed countries account for more than 70% of the world. Lots of products produced in Asian countries are supplied to developed countries for consumption. So their carbon emissions, in fact, are due to Western countries. If carbon emissions are recalculated based on consumption, the per capita level of the United States is nearly 4 times the world average, and 3 times or above that of developing countries such as China and India. However, the US continuously blames China and India for global warming.
Because you'll never accept that you're the one principally to blame. You signed the Rio Formula in 1992 on common and differentiated responsibilities. You like the common part. You like the common part. You like to say we're all in this together and so on. We're not in this together.
US carbon emissions come primarily from energy use, due to lack of adequate management and guidance. The energy use per person in US currently exceeds 80,000 kilowatt hours, 1.4 times that of Russia, 2.6 times that of Europe, 3 times that of China, 11 times that of India, nearly 19 times that of Africa. US troops waged conflicts and increased carbon emissions around the world. If the US military were a nation-state, it would be the 47th largest emitter of GHG in the world, if only taking into account emissions from fuel usage.
And for the same reason, we also have large historic cumulative emissions. That is to say, we burned a lot of fossil fuels, we used the energy, we did good things with those energies, we became wealthy, we created a good standard of living for our people, and in the process, we also produced a large amount of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. And therefore, it's logical to say that these countries, including the United States, are most responsible for the greenhouse gases that are in the atmosphere.
Short-term fluctuations of food production in countries suffering from poverty or war due to US invasions are more likely to develop into a medium to long-term crisis. Carbon emissions only account for one of the factors causing irreversible damage to the ecological security of the Earth. Scientists from the UK provided an algorithm which allows data from ESA's Sentinel satellites to identify plastic pollution in the ocean. Using this algorithm to observe the coast of the province of Binh Thuan in Vietnam, It shows that the yellow part may be the plastic floating in the sea. In Bali, Indonesia, there is also a large area of plastic pollution along the coastline. Scientists estimate that the main source of the ocean plastic pollution spreading in Southeast Asia comes from the United States. According to a report released in 2021 by the National Academy of Sciences, the United States was the world's largest producer of plastic waste, despite only accounting for 4.3% of the world's population. The plastic waste produced by US exceeded the total plastic waste of all European countries. Statistics for this report were recorded as of 2016. US plastic waste reached 42 million tons that year, and about 1 million tons of the waste were discharged into the ocean. After China closed its doors to garbage imports, more of the American plastic waste entered Southeast Asia and polluted the land, water, and ocean there. In 2019, 187 countries reached the Basel Convention, limiting the trade in plastic waste to tackle the global plastic pollution challenge. But the US is not involved in this convention. The US also has not joined the Kyoto Protocol to limit carbon emissions, not joined the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollution. It has not even joined the Convention on the Conservation of Migratory Species of Wild Animals.
We're approaching a record levels of oil and gas production in the United States, and we're on track to set a record of oil production next year. In the United States, 90% of onshore oil production takes place on land that isn't owned by the federal government. And of the remaining 10% that occurs on federal land, the oil and gas industry has millions of acres leased. They have 9,000 permits to drill now. They could be drilling right now, yesterday, last week, last year.
The world's largest resource-consuming country acted slowly in protecting human ecological security, and always gave in to its own realistic interests. By 2030, ecosystem collapse could cause annual losses of nearly $3 trillion. While those most affected will be the poorest and most indebted countries. Business interests drive the US decision-making. Satellite images shows that half of North American prairies, the largest grassland in the world, has been used for agricultural cultivation. Between 2008 and 2016, 4 million hectares of land had been destroyed in the United States. Among them, the increased carbon emissions caused by the destructive development of the grasslands were equivalent to the deforestation of Brazil's tropical forests.
Meanwhile, our landscapes were destroyed. Coal was foisted on India. You foisted coal on us. You were the ones that came and made us coal dependent. And then you left, and now you dare to condescend to us. You condescended to us 400 years ago. You condescended to us 300 years ago. You condescended to us 200 years ago. You condescended to us 100 years ago. You're condescending to us today.
When the US government emphasizes national security, the price would often be the loss of international order and trust. To protect its own economic security, it always suppresses other countries. And it even triggered the global energy crisis and financial crisis. To maintain the American way of life. It often exacerbates global warming and ecological deterioration. It poses a major threat to the American people across the world, and our planet.